tank engines. Or tank locomotives. We're gonna call it tank engines. This is all Thomas's fault. Many people acknowledge tank engines as a thing. But do you really know what they are? Do you? Well, I'm gonna tell you. And it's honestly pretty simple. A tank engine is a type of locomotive, a steam locomotive to be precise, that has tanks. Basically, they carry the water and fuel on board the engine itself and lack a tender that most traditional locomotives have. As a result, a tank engine is a very vague descriptive. There's a lot of engines out there and other designs that could be called tank engines despite not traditionally being referred to as tank engines. Design go all the way back to 1829 with a locomotive called Novelty, built by John Ericsson and John Braithwaite, meant to take part in the Rainhill trials. This was a competition that ran from the 6th to the 14th of October in 1829. Novelty didn't actually win the trial. The crown went to Stephenson's rocket. But over the years, the idea of tank engines stuck around. It wasn't that it was a bad concept, although in the early days, it was thought that they might be unsafe due to the extra weight of all the fuel, as well as the fact the fuel was right there, and if there's something happened, like, wouldn't it catch on fire? But in reality, this is a very unlikely scenario, and let's be fair, tenders don't exactly put the fuel that far away from the engine. It's still right there. And other companies and individuals began designing other engines that were, well, tank engines. On the whole, as a general rule, tank engines had both water tanks and their coal bunkers, or fuel tanks, if they're oil-fired, on board the engine itself. The location and setup varies greatly, and that's usually the difference between different types of tank engine. Arguably, the most common type is the side tank engine, which is actually what Thomas is. The way side tanks work are, well, it's in the name, the tanks are just off to the side of the boiler. This version of tank engines were very common in the UK, mostly in the UK actually. The UK in general, mind you, loves tank engines. They have so many tank engines. They were the tank engine capital of the world. But other countries did use them, mostly in Europe, for reasons I'll get to. The flaw with side tanks, however, is the fact that they tended to cover access to the valve gear, meaning that the length of the tanks was limited in order to allow proper maintenance to be carried out on the valve gear without it being a complete nightmare. But if they didn't run them all the way, that actually limited water capacity, which was also a problem. So many designs did various things, like changing the shape of the tanks and other modifications, in order to keep access to the valve gear relatively painless, but also give the greatest amount of water capacity possible. Another type of tank engine that actually was an attempt to circumvent this problem entirely was the saddle tank design. Saddle tanks put the water tank on top of the boiler, and, well, very much like a saddle on a horse. That's where the name comes from. Percy, from Thomas, is a saddle tank design. Usually the tank is curved around the boiler, but some were more square. This arrangement was patented by Walter Nielsen in 1849. These were very popular for smaller engines, especially for industrial use, because while they did offer a greater water supply when compared to side tanks, as well as allowing better access to the valve gear, their boilers were limited in size because they had to provide extra room for the tank. So most saddle tanks had pretty small boilers and therefore didn't have as much power as a side tank might. The tank also restricted access for cleaning purposes, and because the water was being carried on top of the boiler, that did raise the locomotive's center of gravity, meaning that saddle tanks have much better odds of tipping over. As long as they were designed well, that probably wouldn't be an issue, and because of their smaller boilers, they generally didn't go very fast anyway, but still, they weren't perfect, and for the most part, couldn't use the Belpaire firebox at all. It just couldn't fit underneath a saddle tank, meaning that most of them had to stick with rounded top boilers, which was an older and less efficient design. As an extension to saddle tanks, there's also box tanks. They're pretty much the same in concept, except they're boxes, and not saddles, you know? And for whatever reason, over here in America, we actually went through a phase of using a lot of box tanks. We liked the boxes. Pennsylvania Railroad had some in the very early days, though very quickly we stopped using tank engines almost entirely. but that's for reasons I'll, again, get to. But when we did, they were very often box tanks. Then we have pannier tanks. These are kind of an in-between concept between saddle tanks and side tanks. Pannier tanks are, well, Duck. Remember Duck from Thomas? He's a pannier. In the case of a pannier tank engine, the tanks are carried on the sides, but up, and don't sit on the locomotive's running plates. That leaves a space between the tanks and the running plate, allowing for easy maintenance on, say, the valve gear, for example. Not only does it help with maintenance, but also it means that the tanks can be extended all the way to the front of the engine, as opposed to side tanks that basically could never do that effectively, meaning that they can carry just as much water as a saddle tank, while also not having their sort of restrictions. Mainly that they had a lower center of gravity, that could go much faster than saddle tanks could, and these were considered a very successful design in general. The Great Western Railway, which Duck was from if you recall, loved pannier tanks, and used them effectively for many, many years. Beyond here, though, things start getting a little weirder, not gonna lie. There are well tanks. In the case of a well tank engine, the tank is basically a well on the underside of the locomotive. It's underneath, usually between the locomotive's frames. Novelty, the original tank engine was a well tank, and it has a few advantages. There's a very low center of gravity because the water is underneath, and it didn't limit access to the boiler at all for maintenance purposes. But it was restricted on the basis that there's only so much room underneath the engine. It could only be so big, meaning that their range, even by tank engine standards, was pretty limited, but in specific conditions they thrived, on shorter lines or narrow gauge routes. There are rear tanks, sometimes called back tanks. This is when the tank is placed behind the cab, which is odd already because usually the bunker, where the fuel goes, would be behind the cab. But in this instance, the tank was put there, and it was meant to avoid one of the key issues with tank engines, in that their tractive effort would gradually diminish as they use the water in the tanks. If the water was never on the drivers in the first place, well, then it would never be a factor. And the concept was utilized in the American-built Forney-type steam locomotives. There are wing tanks. What, do they have wings? Do they fly? No, they don't fly. Wind tanks are side tanks, but they run the length of the smoke box instead of the length of the boiler. These weren't seen very much outside of narrow gauge routes, because this design meant that those tanks would almost always be extremely small. Granted, they wouldn't restrict access to the valve gear for maintenance, and that's great, but you couldn't make the tanks very big, so they were pretty much only ever seen on industrial locomotives that only had very short routes or narrow gauge stuff. Inverted saddle tanks are similar to the wing tank. Inverted saddle tanks are frickin' odd. The tanks go underneath the boiler and it basically go the opposite direction as a saddle tank does. Instead of going over it, it goes under it. It was used for similar reasons as the wing tank, but it did provide slightly better water capacity. But this was a very rare design that was utilized. Then there are tender tanks. Okay, so now we're really playing it fast and loose with what constitutes a tank engine. Because a tender tank is a tank engine, yes, but they also have a tender. So are you a tender locomotive, or are you a tank locomotive? Answer me, coward! Well, the intent here was that, frankly, generally in this context, the tender wouldn't actually carry any water, unlike in the case of a true tender engine. The water would still be carried in a tank on the locomotive itself, but because a bunker only offered so much fuel, sometimes it was better for them to have a full-size tender behind the engine to carry the coal or oil that the engine needed. It was seen a lot on narrow gauge routes, but for standard gauge stuff, they usually just went with a full-size tender engine at that point, because why would you? No. But in the context of narrow gauge, it sometimes can help. Those are the general baseline engine designs, but there were a few other funnier ones, like steam trams. Steam trams are, trams, but they run on steam. And because they're trams and couldn't carry tenders behind them, they pretty much always tank engines. They tend to have side plates and cowcatchers. And yes, Toby is a type of steam tram, and also, by definition, a tank engine. Vertical boiler locomotives are also technically tank engines as well, for the most part. These were small engines, and to be honest, are their own topic, but they have their place in railroad history as well. And tank engines sometimes got weird, man. Like, there's crane engines, too. Steam engines with cranes on them. And in very, very, very few cases, there were some tank engines that were streamlined for, like, high-speed passenger service. Now, why would you ever do that? Well, it basically never happened, but occasionally it did. And it was because they were running very short lines, but they still wanted to make them look fancy and fast, so they still streamlined a tank engine, but it was pretty rarely seen in the grand scheme of things. And tank engines do have significant advantages as well as disadvantages when compared to traditional tender engines. Their advantages consist of, well, shunting. They're really good at shunting, mostly because tank engines are very good at going both forward and backwards. Tender engines generally have a problem with reversing because the tender's in the way, unless they're using a specially designed tender to circumvent that problem. But tank engines can pretty much always go forward and backward equally well, meaning until diesels came along, their use in yards, for example, was nearly unrivaled. They tend to be smaller, which again helps them in yards and also makes them cheaper to operate and cheaper to build in the first place. And most designs offer much better thermo efficiency. See, because the tanks are right there next to the engine's boiler, it means that they are, by extension, being heated by the boiler, not just the firebox. That means that the water is being, well, preheated, reaching a boiling point even faster, and meaning that tank engines tend to start up quicker. Now, this can actually backfire if it gets too hot, because excessively hot water can interfere with the steam injector operation. So, you want to be careful, but for the most part, it's considered a pretty good thing as long as the locomotive is being operated appropriately. Another both good thing and bad thing, which is how we're going to get into the bad things, is that the fuel and the water adds to the adhesive weight. For most tank engines, with the exception of back tanks, the tanks are directly above the driving wheels, meaning that the fuel itself adds to the weight of the engine and therefore adds to tractive effort. That's good, but by extension it means that if you get low on water, it means the tractive effort diminishes and can cause problems, so it is something to keep in mind. And into the problems of tank engines, well, for example, there's limited fuel and water capacity. A tank engine can only carry so much, and a tender offers an entirely separate car that is designed specifically to carry as much water and fuel as possible. A tank engine is always going to be hampered by the engine bit, limiting their range overall. They can also be a bit unstable due to the water sloshing back and forth inside the tanks. But this could be mitigated in the design phase as long as the engineers know, that could be a problem. But they also had issues with axle loading limits. Because the larger a tank engine gets, the heavier it's going to get, and that's normal, but it gets much more difficult to factor in the fuel and the water without needing more axles than a rigid frame can actually deal with. And they also had to deal with limits with the boiler diameter. Because the tanks had to be there, everything had to fit within the loading gauge for the railway being run on. So the boiler couldn't be gigantic on tank engines usually because the tanks had to go somewhere. It was always one of those give and take kind of deals, and finding a good balance could be difficult in some cases, but it depends on the design. Regardless of the issues overall, though, the tank engine has seen much popularity the world over, again, mostly in Europe. And this is because, well, take the UK for example. They're a relatively small country in the grand scheme of things. There are more fuel and water stops, and less long distances for tank engines to have to run, meaning even outside of the yards, tank engines could work on the main lines and branch lines without much of a problem. Over here in America, things were different. Beyond the 1800s or so, we kind of stopped using tank engines for the most part, and this is because the distances involved. A tank engine couldn't handle basically any of our long-distance routes, meaning we almost always went with tender engines. And we got so used to tender engines, we even started making tender engines for shunting purposes, designing special tenders that wouldn't limit the sightline of the engineer. The only places you'd find tank engines over here are in very short industrial lines, or occasionally narrow gauge. But compared to the UK, we basically had none. They had tank engines out the wazoo, and we were like, no! We don't need any more of those. What we need is big, chunky, just gigantic nonsense all over the place. The most powerful engines you can possibly imagine. Infinite loading gauge. USA! 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 That was kind of our thing. I think that's fair to say. But it doesn't mean we don't like tank engines over here, and I think that has mostly to do with the popularity of Thomas. Many of us over in America first saw a tank engine within the Thomas series, and there's something endearing about these plucky little engines. They certainly had their uses and served faithfully, and many did wind up in preservation, especially in the UK. Again, you guys just love your tank engines, and more power to ya! I ain't gotta come down on them at all, I love the little things. So until next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.